Good evening, and welcome to our final guest of honor event, which is our Q&A. Ch'iang is one of the most decorated and esteemed short fiction writers in the history of science fiction. In this Q&A, we'll be discussing his life and career. I'm going to start us off with a few questions and then turn to the audience. We will have a mic, so you can ask your questions to the mic, so the video cameras can pick it up. I may have follow-up questions to some of yours. While some of you are, I'm sure, old fans, some others may be new to Ted's work or have only read some of his stories. For that reason, we will try to stay away from spoilers during this discussion. Please take heed of this when you ask your questions. My first question is, what got you into science fiction?
I would say Isaac Asimov got me into science fiction. When I was around 11 or 12, I read the Foundation trilogy and then his robot stories. And I think, yeah, and a lot of his other work. And all of that, I think, had a big impact on me. And that was when I started trying to write science fiction. Also, actually, Asimov had a big impact on me, even outside of science fiction, because he wrote a lot of popular science books, which really sparked my imagination. He had this volume, Asimov's New Guide to Science, which where he covered sort of a brief history of all of science, and there are parts of it I still remember the explanations in that volume. It is. Yeah, again, in a lot of ways, it's hard for me to sort of overstate the effect that his work had on me at that time.
Apart from Asimov, who are some of your other early favorites?
I was also a fan of Arthur C. Clarke, and yeah, it's not a surprising name.
Not incredibly, no.
But I will say that I was never really a Heinlein fan. But I definitely was an Arthur C. Clarke fan. I encountered him a little later than Asimov, but his a lot of his work was also enormously influential on me, and I think Clarke. Okay, well, because I think a lot of Asimov's strongest work was at shorter lengths, but I think shorter length was not Clarke's best length. I think Clarke was best at novel length, and there, again, I don't know how widely read he is now, but I think he had a really remarkable scientific imagination. He is sort of known as or credited with the idea of the geosynchronous satellite, but there are a lot of other things, other elements in various novels of his where I think he did a really good job of envisioning the near future technology in a way that Asimov's work was often set further into the future or involved things like his positronic robots, which really had no, Asimov would say he had no idea how they worked. But with Clarke, Clarke actually, he thought about practical technology in a way that Asimov did not.
You studied at Clarion, probably the most legendary science fiction writers workshop, and have taught it. What made you decide to go there, and what kind of an influence do you think it had on you as a writer?
Well, I went because it had a reputation as being a great place to learn how to write, and it had an enormous influence on me in a few different ways. I talked a bit about this yesterday, but one of the ways that it was a profound experience for me was before I attended Clarion, I was working in total isolation. I didn't know anyone else who read science fiction, let alone was trying to write science fiction. And I've been submitting stories and collecting rejection slips and starting to wonder if science fiction was really something I ought to be pursuing. And then I went to Clarion, and I was surrounded by people who had read all the same books I'd read and were trying to write the way I was going to write. And I got positive feedback on my work. I definitely had the experience which Clarion is often described as it felt like I was discovering a family I didn't know I had, or really finding my tribe. And on that level, Clarion had a life-changing effect on me. In terms of my actual writing, the impact on my writing is less clear for, I think, some different reasons. One is that I'm not a real fast writer. I think fast writers can get a lot of benefit out of Clarion by producing a lot of stories and getting feedback on a lot of stories during the 6 weeks. But I still learned a lot about writing at Clarion because I was surrounded by people who we were all critiquing the same stories and talking about how stories worked and how to achieve certain effects. And yes, and there are conversations from Clarion that I still remember pretty clearly, and those are the effect of those was not. I think those a lot of times the effect of experiences like that, they're not immediate. You don't suddenly become a better writer, but over time, as you internalize all the things that you learned, you talked about, the effect, the impact shows up later on.
Your first published story, Tower of Babylon, won the Nebula Award. That's not a very common occurrence. Where did that story come from, and how did its winning impact you?
Where did that story come from? That's sort of a...
Because we were talking about the Tower of Babel, of the original Tower of Babel just 2 days ago in the linguistics panel.
Yes, yes, yes we were. Actually, I suppose it originally came, I had an idea for a completely different story. I actually wanted to write a story about I guess, what is sometimes called a space elevator or an orbital tower. An elevator that goes all the way up to geosynchronous orbit. And I actually wanted to write a story about a space elevator that survives the fall of technological civilization, and then would trace the attempts of, as civilization rose again, it would trace the attempts of people to try and make sense of this tower and then try and scale this tower. But I
that could be a novel.
I mean, I still sort of like that idea. But I suppose now that I've just talked about it, someone else will go write it. And
no one tell anyone.
We promise. Tell that to Scott Westerfeld.
But yeah, I didn't really know what to do with that that idea. I thought about it for a while and I just couldn't come up with anything. But I guess I mentioned it to a friend, and he said, well, that reminded him of the Tower of Babel story, and the version of the Tower of Babel story that I was familiar with, it's the one in Genesis. It's very brief and doesn't really give you a sense of the scale of the project. But my friend, he had gone to Hebrew school and learned a much more elaborate version where people were born and died. They spent their entire lives on the tower, and it was they never set foot on the earth itself. So it described this really massive undertaking, and that sparked my imagination. The idea of just a low tech, but really a mega engineering project that lasting generations. So that was the genesis of that story. As for the impact of winning a Nebula Award for it, I can't. I mean, it was a very surreal experience for me, and I don't know that it was really good for me in a lot of ways.
You had your biggest gap as a writer was between stories, was between Understand, which didn't come out long after Tower of Babylon, and Story of Your Life. That was 7 years. Do you think that this huge impact the beginning of your career had affected that?
I do think it did. I mean, I think there were a lot of different things that played into that. I definitely felt, you know, as a sort of enormous weight of expectation after having won the Nebula. So you know, that was one factor. There were other factors. I had just started a new job, and it was a very demanding job, and it was very easy to spend you know, evenings and weekends working at that job. Also, I did actually get the idea for Story of Your Life around that time, but I knew that I knew that the story I envisioned, you know, I knew it was a very ambitious story, and I actually felt it was beyond my capabilities as a writer at that point. So I figured I would have to become a better writer before I could attempt that story, and also I also realized I needed to learn linguistics to write that story. So so I spent 6 or 7 years reading linguistics in my spare time and thinking about that story. So all of these are sort of contributing factors.
Speaking of Story of Your Life, it's going to be a movie. It's in post-production. Can you tell us a bit about the production and anything, you know, how it came about and your thoughts about it?
Sure. Again, I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the movie came about through a sort of atypical, an atypical route. I think what is most common is that some producers will option a story, and then they will hire a screenwriter to take a crack at it. What happened here was sort of the reverse. A screenwriter named Eric Heiserer, he was a fan of the story, and he pitched it to some producers. And they liked his pitch, and they got in touch with me. And Eric Heiserer, he was willing to write a screenplay on spec, which meaning that he would not get paid up front. He would write the screenplay for free in anticipation of it getting bought later.
Yeah, which we should mention is a very, very, very rare. Most of the work screenwriters get paid for, you never see, and it's never made. They get hired to try and develop something, and nothing happens. So writing on spec currently these days is very rare.
Well, actually, I think to slightly amend that, writing on spec is something that beginning screenwriters have to do, but Eric Heiserer had already had screenplays made into movies, and so someone in his position, he did not have to do anything on spec if he didn't want to. He could get paid up front, but he was sufficiently passionate about the project that he was willing to do it on spec, and so I thought that was a meaningful indicator. The producers who contacted me, they actually this was, I think, around 2011. They sent me a DVD of of a film called Incendies. It was the first film by a director named דידי. And they said, this is sort of, you know, a director that we would like to have on this project. And I don't know how many of you have seen Incendies, but it's a very interesting film. I highly recommend it. And it's also interesting because it is told in sort of non-chronological fashion. And I thought that was a very interesting choice of a potential director that they had in mind. If they had sent me a DVD of a Michael Bay film, I probably would not have paid much more attention to them.
Yeah, the idea of a Michael Bay directed adaptation of one of his stories is weirdly fascinating to me now that you brought it up. I mean, it would obviously be terrible, but very exploding.
But so anyway, all of that, the fact that the screenwriter was enthusiastic and the producers, they were willing to go with a sort of non-obvious choice for director. Those were all factors that I found encouraging. So so I granted them permission, and it took a few years, but eventually they got financing, and and they got Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner attached to the film. Filming took place outside of Montreal this past summer. I got to visit the set. I shook hands with Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner.
Sounds exciting.
I will say that it was very interesting to see the process of filming a movie. It was it was not what I expected, because filming a motion picture proceeds very, very slowly. They will spend 45 minutes setting up cameras and lights, and then the stars will come out of their trailer. They will film a 30-second shot. They'll do a few takes of that, then they'll go back, and then it's another 45 minutes of moving lights and cameras around. And so during a day, they will shoot just a like maybe a minute or two of screen time, and I was there for 2 days, and on the first day I did not hear any dialogue at all. The second day I got to hear some dialogue, but it was just a handful of lines, and I heard them over and over and over again.
Was any of the lines from the story, or?
Not on the days that I was there. But that, yeah. But yeah, it was very interesting to just to see how modern movie making is done. In a lot of ways, it is really impressive that that a process which takes place at such a an incremental pace, almost glacially slow, can be assembled into a final product like a motion picture you see, because in the act of making it, you don't really get any sense of the story at all, of any narrative momentum, and I came away very impressed with the fact that like actors, they have to be able to deliver a line with emotion. They have to get into the right frame of mind, deliver a line with emotion, and then wait another 45 minutes before they come back, and then deliver that line again, with emotion, and so they are over the course of a couple months they are performing, they're creating a performance, and that seems to me a very difficult thing. So yeah, that was just one of the things that struck me about the set visit.
Are you optimistic about a movie?
And
have you seen any of it?
I've not
even
seen
dailies or.
No, I've not seen any of it. I mean, other than the tiny fragments that were being filmed while I was there. I'm cautiously optimistic. I've read a couple drafts of the screenplay. It does depart significantly from my story, but it would have to, because I think, if you've read this story, you know that a truly faithful adaptation of that is not something a lot of people would see. In order to
that could that sounds like a student film could do that and be very experimental and interesting and try to be as faithful as possible, but
yeah, but if you are trying to raise money to actually make a movie, you will need to make a movie that is accessible to a general audience. But when I read the draft of the screenplay, I felt like, despite the changes made, which make it in a lot of ways a Hollywood movie, I felt that it captured something essential about my story, and if that can be translated onto the screen successfully, I will be happy. I will consider it a success.
My final question before I turn over to our lovely audience: who are you excited about as a reader? What writers in science fiction coming up recently are you excited about, interested in?
Well, in some ways, this this is like the question from yesterday's panel about what have I read recently, or what favorite.
I originally had favorite writers, but the other two panelists didn't want it.
Well, all right. So I'll talk about. I'll just mention some of my favorite writers, whether sort of new or upcoming or not. I've often mentioned Greg Egan as one of my favorite writers, and I think a lot of people if you've read Greg Egan's work, it probably comes as no surprise that I'm a big fan of his work. In a lot of ways, I think I am. I'm the exact target audience for Greg Egan. I think that if you were to classify, if you're trying to group science fiction writers by, in terms of scientific accuracy, there would be, to a first approximation, you could say there's Greg Egan and then there's everybody else. So I'm a big fan of his work. On the more sort of fantasy side of things, I quite like. I've quite enjoyed China Miéville's novels. I'm particularly fond of his novels, The Scar and Embassy Town. I think you're reading his novels sort of made clear to me just how unimaginative a lot of other writers are. And he has a real gift for language that is also very rare in science fiction and fantasy. And then so that I mentioned this yesterday, but a new and up-and-coming writer that I think is very interesting is Alice Sola Kim, whose story that I mentioned yesterday was Mothers Lock Up Your Daughters Because They Are Terrifying, published in Tin House. But she has had other interesting stories. Wong's Billion Daughters, I think The Other Graces. I think she is a really interesting new voice in science fiction.
Okay, and now we will go to the audience section of our Q&A. We have a lovely mic model over here. So if you want to ask a question, I'll raise your hand. I'll pass the mic and you can ask. Laz. Just pass it through to people.
One thing I noticed about your stories is that you are sometimes inspired by elements from different cultures, like the Jewish legend of the Golem or the Arabian Night stories. So, two questions here. What draws you to stories, to these or other elements from different cultures, and what kind of process do these elements go when you implement them in your stories?
Well, I don't know if I can, really speak about a sort of any general tendency which leads me to other cultures. I can talk about like the specifics of those individual stories. For example, okay, so the Arabian Nights story that you mentioned is the Merchant and the Alchemist Gate. and the initial inspiration was, it was not originally to write an Arabian Nights story. I wound up there because I'd been thinking about time travel stories, and I have this whole long sort of spiel I could go through about time travel stories, but specifically I was thinking about a time travel story where it's impossible to change the past, and people are okay with that. And I was wondering, what a story like that might look like. And it struck me that one possible way to tell a story like that would be in a culture where there is a deep acceptance of the will of God, that whatever happens, it's God's will, and so that's, it struck me like, oh, well, possibly a Muslim setting would be a good place to tell a story like that. And then it occurred to me that I could set the story in medieval medieval times, and in technological terms, we are in the modern day, we are as far from time travel as medieval times. We are not appreciably closer to building a time machine than they were in medieval Baghdad. So there's no greater unlikelihood by setting it in medieval Baghdad, and also because the Arabian Nights has a sort of characterized by a tales within tales, stories within stories format, and I thought that also kind of was fitting with, I think, a lot of time travel stories, which kind of a lot of them loop back on themselves. So all of those reasons sort of made me think, I think a good way to tell this story would be as an Arabian Nights story. So that was what led me to read a lot of read a bunch of translations of the Thousand Nights and a Night, and some of the critical interpretations of that work, and so that was what drew me to that particular case. In the case of, so the myth of the golem, and that is something I use in my story 72 Letters, and that was that arose because I was I guess I was interested in the idea of in historical ideas of artificial beings, and I thought the golem myth was particularly interesting because it is an artificial being who that is created through a linguistic process instead of, say, a chemical or an biological process, and the fact that the golem is traditionally mute, unable to speak. I thought that given that that a golem is created linguistically, and the fact that a golem is unable to speak seemed, not a coincidence. That a golem that is unable to speak is unable to create another golem. So that made me, do some reading about Kabbalistic magic and ideas of the creative power of language, and so that is sort of how I wound up building a story around that. So I guess these are so it's hard. I don't know if I can generalize from these different examples. All I can do is I can talk about the process for individual stories, but I don't know if I can usefully generalize across them.
So, Ted, in many of your stories, with some of your stories, the Tower of Babylon, you're looking into religious subject from a very secular point of view. 72 Letters, you're dwelling into Jewish magic, which is part of Jewish culture, but especially in Hell is the Absence of God, where none of the characters have a dialogue, by the way. So it seems to me that you're looking at religion and faith from a very, I would say, that's how it seems to me, from a very cynical point of view. And I was wondering, what is your approach to religion at all, and is it true? I mean, also, why no dialogues in Hell of the Absence of God? But that's like the minor question. Thanks.
I don't know, am I cynical about religion? I think that, that might be a question better answered by others than myself.
By the way, I'm cynical about religion, so it's totally fine.
Well, I will say that I'm an atheist, but I will also say that I was raised without any religion, so I do not have the personal relationship to religion that a lot of people do. Neither pro nor con. I think there are a lot of people who have a strong antipathy toward religion because they were raised with religion, and I cannot say that is the case with me, because I'm not rebelling against a religious upbringing. In that sense, my interest in religion is more abstract rather than personal. Whether that equates to cynicism or not, I can't say. I remember a friend of mine, he, after he read Hell is the Absence of God, he said that my take on religion made him think of someone who knows the words but can't hear the music. And it may be that what he was getting at is what you were getting at, that because I have no personal experience with religion, I cannot draw from what I think a lot of religious people have, which is, for instance, some feeling that of the presence of the divine in in the world. I must honestly say I have never felt the presence of the divine. So and so because of that, yeah, I guess that probably does limit my ability to write about religious experience. But on the other hand, I would say that I also I don't, like I said, I don't have the antipathy to religion that a lot of people do. So I don't feel that I am as angry about religion as some formerly religious people are. I think religion is, I think a lot of religions, there is something very interesting about the religious worldview. I am, I guess, in general interested in different ways of understanding the world. I think that is one of the things that draws me to science fiction, and so a religious way of viewing the world is different than mine, and so in some ways that may be why I find it interesting to try and view the world in a way different than I myself do. But I do also want to say that, I think that nowadays, science and religion are often seen as being in opposition, and but that has not always been the case. Many early scientists were devoutly religious, and they did not see any incompatibility between the two. They thought that understanding how the universe worked was a way of honoring God, of understanding the beauty of His creation. And I think that there is something very very similar between religious awe and what scientists experience when they make a conceptual breakthrough. I think that I think that is why those that's why early scientists like Newton could why he could be devoutly religious, because the experience of understanding how the universe worked filled him with a sensation that that was akin to religious awe, or perhaps completely indistinguishable from religious awe. And given that I am interested in sort of scientific idea of conceptual breakthroughs as part of the process of scientific discovery, that is, I think, probably the closest that I can come to having any personal connection to religious experience. But I guess that I think that is why religion recurs in my work.
Hi.
Hello.
My question is about the Tower of Babylon. A couple of choices, artistic choices you made in that story.
Yes.
Like you mentioned earlier, in the Bible it appears very briefly and very early, before Abraham. And supposedly happened to people in a faraway land who worshipped many gods. But in your story, they all believe in the same God, no matter which country they came from. And not only that, but they refer to him by his name, as it is in Judaism. And maybe you were told, but the translator, I suppose he had no choice, but in Hebrew he had to use the tetragrammaton, the sacred name, which is the English.
Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah.
In Yud. But in English it appears as Yahweh, not Jehovah. So I was wondering what made you make these changes to the original story, if I can put it this way. What drew you to those choices?
That's a tough one. It's been a long time since I wrote that story, so I'm not sure I can remember what lay behind those specific decisions. Yeah, gosh, I don't know that I can. I don't remember, why I picked Yahweh as the name to refer to God in that story. I think that I did draw a lot of inspiration from the more detailed account of there are a much more detailed version of the Tower of Babel story in this book, Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews. That is in that account, it actually mentions things like if a brick fell from the top of the tower, people despaired because it would take a full year for another brick to be brought up from the ground. But if a man fell to his death, they didn't care because there was another man right there to replace him. And my impression is that in that version, and again, it's been so long since I've read it, but my impression is that in that version, they all believe in the same God and are working cooperatively. Although I may be misremembering that. But from this distance, what I can recall is that I think I was drawing a lot of inspiration from the account in Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews. I'm afraid I don't have a better answer for you than that. I'm sorry.
Right over here in the middle, right in front of me. No, you, yeah.
דידי, אני יכול לשאול בעברית ותתרגם? יש הרבה מקרים במדע בדיוני שסיפורים נכתבו מחדש, הרבה פעמים הוגדלו. הדוגמה אולי הכי טובה זה המשחק של אנדר. האם לטד יש איזשהו סיפור קצר או טיוטה, סיפור מגירה שמעולם לא פרסם, שהוא היה רוצה לבקר שוב, אולי להפוך אותו לאיזה נובלה?
There are many examples in science fiction fantasy of stories being rewritten as a novel or expanded in some way. Is there anything you wrote or anything you wrote and haven't published that you're thinking that you might rework at some point?
Not really. Well, okay, so in terms of like just the general idea of expanding a short story into a novel, you know, as I said before, you know, if I felt that, you know, an idea that I had, you know, really required a novel to address adequately, I would try and write a novel. But I think that in general, I've said what I wanted to say about each idea in, I've addressed it, you know, to my satisfaction within a short story, or, you know, a novelette or novella. So, so I don't feel like I, you know, could expand any of them to novel length. I will, okay, those of you who were at the short story panel yesterday will remember I mentioned something about initially having a different conception in mind for a story, Liking What You See. That I initially had a sort of a longer version of the story in mind, and what, because of deadline pressure, I was forced to write a shorter version of that story. And so, you know, I'm sometimes asked, well, you know, would you ever think about writing that longer version that you originally had in mind? And I you know, I definitely would have wanted to, had I, you know, had the opportunity at the time, but having, you know, had to write the shorter version, you know, I sort of had to adjust my conception of it, and, you know, I guess, you know, since the shorter form, you know, is what I wrote and it exists, you know, it has sort of, I guess, in a lot of ways, crystallized my, or fixed my imagination on that topic. So, again, I don't feel like I could I write a longer version of that. I feel that, you know, because I guess I worked hard to try and get everything I wanted to say about that into the shorter version, and so now that the shorter version is out there, I guess I feel like I'm pretty much done with that. So, yeah, I'm afraid I don't think I'm going to be expanding any of my existing work.
You right over here in the blue.
Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to hear actually just a little bit about your writing process, because there's so much research. It sounds like years of, you know, reading about linguistics or whatever. Do you write simultaneously while you're researching? And then I guess a separate question is, what does your first draft look like? Is it fairly complete? Like, would you say it's 90%, or would you say it's 40%? Like, how does that process go for you?
We kind of dealt with the second half of the question yesterday, I think.
A little bit.
Maybe
Yeah,
concentrate more on the first.
So, well, okay, but just, you know, to answer that, because, you know, because, yeah, not everyone was there at yesterday's panel, but okay, so I'll, to describe my process, in general, I need, in general, I know the ending of a story before I start writing. And in fact, usually the first actual sentence I write is often a sentence from somewhere near the end of the story. And, you know, that was the case even with Story of Your Life, which, you know, yeah, I wrote down a sentence with, from close to the end of the story, and so it was like 7 years later that I actually finished the story. But yeah, I had that ending in mind. And in the case of Stir Your Life, over those years when I was reading up on linguistics, I was thinking about the story, and I would write down other fragments over that period of time. But in general, I wouldn't say that I write in distinct drafts. I don't do a lot of I don't do a lot of drafts. I think mostly I write one draft very, very slowly. Then I do rewriting. I do some rewriting after that, but for the most part, it is creating that first draft is where by far the bulk of the time is spent, because, like I said, so yeah, I need to know the ending. I'll write something from the ending of the story first, then I will write pieces of the story really in no particular order. I don't write, from the beginning and then forward to the end. I write the scenes completely out of order, and then eventually I extend those fragments until they all connect up into a first, into a complete story. And so,
which is a little bit like the making of a movie. In some ways,
but
there's also a lot of fragments and all out of order as well.
Yes, yes. So I guess I guess in answer to your question, I don't do a lot of successive drafts. I spend most of my effort, if you want to call that a first draft, would be the process of writing pieces until they all connect up into one continuous story. That is where most of the most of the time is spent for me, and then the amount of time rewriting that afterwards is small, significantly smaller, I would say.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Well, I've been wondering, Didy mentioned that it has been 7 years between your first and second story and the next one.
Third and fourth.
Third and fourth, okay. And you said that you didn't feel that you were a good enough writer to write a story of your life that I wanted to write. And I wondered, how do you improve yourself as a writer? How did you become, and how do you become the writer that you want to be, that you feel that will be able to write those stories?
There's no easy answer for that. I guess, again, one of the things I said in yesterday's panel was that writing is something where a lot of writers feel that the further you progress as a writer, the more difficult it becomes, because you're more conscious of all the different all the different variables, all the different ways to tell a story, all the everything that has come before, and to what extent you're repeating those or writing in reaction to those. So there is I think I guess the only thing to say is that you keep reading fiction. You keep thinking about how why what is the writer doing here? Can I now that I see how it's done, can I do it? Can I do it in a way that another reader can't see that it's being done? I think this is why a lot of fiction writers find it hard to read for enjoyment, because they're conscious of how things are being done, and they're very aware of what is happening, and so as a writer, you are sort of hoping that your readers don't see how it is being done. But again, you don't want dumb readers, but you I guess in a sense you are sort of well, I guess you can hope that your readers are not as they are not writers themselves, but I guess there is an extent to which you are constantly trying to outthink yourself. And I guess I'm sure that is an entirely unsatisfactory answer, but that's the only one I have.
It's actually okay, because that's what I'm doing when I'm waiting. So it's a very satisfactory answer. Thank you.
Hello. It's really strong. I was wondering, it's a bit personal, were you experimenting with other kinds of art, like poetry or painting or any other kinds of expression before you gravitated on short stories?
Not really. I mean, okay, so I started trying to write science fiction when I was like 11 or 12. So I can't really say that, so what was I doing before then? Probably, things that a lot of, kids are doing, I drew a lot of pictures as a kid, but I can't say that, I did, made a serious investigation into art as a form of self-expression. Writing prose fiction is the endeavor that I've been engaged in the longest. It is. I will admit that the very first thing I tried to write was not a short story; it was a novel, and I didn't get very far. I think
Page 11.
I mean, I don't know exactly how far, but like a chapter or two, and then sort of didn't know where to go from there.
He asked if that's what you started to write when you were 11.
Yes. And So I don't. I can't, say that. I gave serious attention to other modes of expression before that. I have sort of dabbled a little bit in other things. I took a class in animation as an adult, and over the course of the class, we made every student made a 10-second film, and again, that really impressed me, like just how much effort goes into making a 10-second animated film, because you're creating at a minimum 120 pictures, possibly 240 pictures, and depending on what the format of those are, it can be quite time consuming. But I guess that was not something I really considered pursuing seriously. That was more just out of curiosity. So I guess for me it's pretty much just prose fiction.
To you, not you, behind you? Yeah, okay.
אפשר לתרגם לעברית? את מה שאני אומרת? אני באנגלית. בבית מטבחיים 5... אוקיי. בבית מטבחיים 5, שאני מניחה שהשפיעה מאוד על הכתיבה של סיפור חייך, יש אמירה שסופרי מדע בדיוני נוטים להזניח כתיבה ועלילה לטובת רעיונות מדעיים. האם האמירה הזאת השפיעה עליך בכתיבה של סיפור חייך? ומה המקום שאתה נותן למדע בתהליכים הרגשיים שהדמויות שלך עוברות?
Okay, there's an assumption made in this question, which is that you were that the writing of Story of Your Life was influenced by Slaughterhouse-5. Under that assumption, the question is, in Slaughterhouse-5, there's a statement that science fiction writers often put... תנסחי שוב מחדש על זה? המיקרופון ממש.
שהמון פעמים רעיונות מדעיים מונעים מסופרי מדע בדיוני לעסוק בכתיבה טובה בפיתוח דמויות.
That science fiction writers often, let's say, back burner good writing and character development in favor of ideas and developing ideas, and did that concept influence you in your writing of Story of Your Life?
Well, okay, I have to say that when I wrote Story of Your Life, I had not read Slaughterhouse-5. But I am aware that of that criticism that Kurt Vonnegut had of science fiction writers is certainly a common one. It's not unique to him. I know that he has made he has criticized science fiction for that reason, but many other people have criticized science fiction for that reason.
Especially hard science fiction.
Yes, of course. And I was not explicitly setting out to work in reaction to that statement, whether by Vonnegut or anyone else who makes a similar statement. But in the case of Story of Your Life, my initial conception of that story it was clear that it was a very intensely personal story. Because, as I said, the first sentence I wrote was a sentence from very near the end of that story, and it is. It's from sort of the, kind of the emotional climax of that story. So I was, so in the case of that story, the emotional side of it was was the inspiration for it. So it came at the very beginning. I actually, what I worried about when writing that story was whether I could put in enough, because there is sort of a fair amount of scientific exposition in the story, and I wondered if I would it be possible to put that into the story, into the same story that would end with this on this emotional note. And for a long time I thought, I don't know if it's possible to for these disparate elements to work in one story. I often thought this was sort of an impossible task, but for that story, the emotional aspect came first. So there wasn't really a danger of it getting pushed to the side, because for me that was the most important part of it.
Hi. There is a recurring theme in science fiction about how to change or prevent the future. In at least 3 stories that you wrote, you say the exact opposite, that you cannot. I talk about what's expected of us, exhalation, and also stories of your life. And what I'm interested in is, did you write it because, do you revisit that notion because you think it produces the best fiction, or because you actually believe in this really depressing determinism?
Okay, so that is that's the question of free will versus determinism is definitely one that I find fascinating, and in some ways, it is definitely a theme that I find myself coming back to again and again. But I would actually, object to your characterization of it in those stories that you cite. Because if I were to actually, if someone were to ask me, like, what 3 stories of mine address free will and determinism, I would not have picked Exhalation as one of them. Because,
agreed.
Because Exhalation is about the heat death of the universe, that it's about entropy, and I think that you can whatever your stance on the free will versus determinism question, that is completely independent of sort of the acceptance that entropy is a thing, the heat death of the universe is inevitable. I feel like those are those are not tightly coupled questions. So I don't think exhalation is actually about free will versus determinism. In some, I would say that Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate is about free will versus determinism.
My friends say haven't read it.
Okay, fair enough.
If you see a postcard with that story on it, you can scan the barcode and buy it.
But okay, so free will versus determinism. Okay, so with regard to those two stories, Story of Your Life and then What's Expected of Us, those stories actually, I think, make two different arguments. They make contrary arguments on this question. Among philosophers, there are two basic camps on the free will versus determinism question. Maybe there someone say there are four, but I'll say there are two basic camps. One is the compatibilist, and one is the incompatibilist camp. Compatibilists believe that free will is compatible with determinism. That the only meaningful definitions of free will are completely compatible with a deterministic universe. That the idea of free will that doesn't work in a deterministic universe is that's a sort of incoherent notion of free will. On the other hand, incompatibilists argue the opposite, that they say that the only meaningful free will is incompatible with a deterministic universe, and any version that is compatible with a deterministic universe is not really free will. Under this distinction, I would say Story of Your Life is actually a compatibilist story, while What's Expected of Us is an incompatibilist story. Because I think that Story of Your Life is ultimately making an argument that what the character is freely choosing is, in fact, what will inevitably happen. And so that is a compatibilist argument. What's Expected of Us is essentially arguing, kind of arguing the opposite. I sort of think of What's Expected of Us as kind of a horror story, in philosophical terms, but there actually has been some interesting work, some interesting research on whether belief in free will, how does that affect how people behave, and if people who don't believe they have free will, do they behave badly because they think it's not their fault? And there is some research which suggests that yes, if people believe that there is no such thing as free will, they behave worse. And so, the conclusion of that research is, it's better if we believe we have free will. It doesn't matter whether we have it or not. It's better that we believe we do, because obviously, the people, whether either people have free will or they don't, but merely the belief that they have it is changing how they're behaving.
Doesn't that prove that we do?
I don't think it proves that we do at all.
Not philosophically, sure, but practically, the moment we can say, let's believe that, so we act better, our belief has an impact.
Actually, I think what it proves is not that it doesn't actually address the free will versus determinism question. In some ways, I think it actually addresses the fatalism question, which is somewhat different. Fatalism is the claim that certain outcomes are inevitable no matter what you try to do, and I think this research shows that no, the same outcome does not obtain no matter what you try to do, because clearly different outcomes are possible depending on what people are trying to do. So fatalism clearly not true, but I think we sort of knew that anyway. Fatalism. I don't know that fatalism ever had a really. I don't know if there was ever a really good argument in favor of fatalism.
Depression. Depression is an excellent argument in favor of fatalism, and now that we have taken fatalism down, I think this is a great time to say thank you, a heartfelt thank you to our guest of honor, Ch'iang, for being here and for being such a wonderful writer and an excellent human, and thank you for coming.